This is this is 10 days ago. I mean, the story has moved so quickly in just the span of a few days.
Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. And it is certainly unique, as we are all aware by now. Things are a little different. I'm not in a studio as we normally are. I'm at home. And in case you're wondering, that is the Croatian flag behind me. My mom's side of the Jacopak family will be very proud to be represented. But we are not here to talk about that. We are here to talk about updates in the Northwest as they are coronavirus and not coronavirus, specifically, as they relate to Idaho. And joining us today to talk about those things in Idaho, education-wise and otherwise, is Kevin Richert of Idaho Education News. Thanks for joining us today, Kevin.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kevin, let's start things off right now. As we record this in the middle of the week, things will be changing almost minute by minute on this topic of coronavirus and how states are responding. So we're going to try not to talk too much about specific numbers and those sorts of things, and also talk a little bit more about policy and how the states are responding. So in that regard, just give a quick overview from recent events. How has the state of Idaho and specifically Governor Brad Little responded?
The policy pivot that we've seen in the past couple of days has been really stunning. On Monday afternoon, the governor's State Board of Education issued a 4-week closure of all of the state's public schools. This came on the heels of most school districts in the state already deciding independently to close their doors or to extend spring break or to look at trying to do an online education delivery model. The state board stepped in and did a hard stop and said, all schools will be closed in the sense that the kids will not be going into school for classes for the next 4 weeks. So the hard stop goes at least until April 20th. And then you have to fast forward to Wednesday, Governor Little issuing a 21-day stay-at-home order that affects every non-essential employee in the state, and kind of comes on the heels of what we had was kind of a mixed bag. Some cities issuing more aggressive orders in terms of closing businesses or urging people to work from home. You had an isolation order in Blaine County, which is home to the Sun Valley Ski Resort and has been kind of the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak in Idaho. This is a statewide order, and it came in the wake of the first a couple of reports of community spread of coronavirus in Idaho.
So on the note of some of those orders, you said Monday, March 23rd, the State Board of Education sort of steps in, if you will, and makes that decision to close all statewide public schools, and many had already closed by that point. And many people noted, though, that in doing so, Idaho became among the last states. I think at that point there was only 4 states that hadn't made that decision statewide. Can you just speculate a little bit on some of the dynamics there? Why was Idaho sort of reluctant? Why was the governor not doing that before?
Well, Governor Little pinned a lot of his approach to the school closures on guidelines from the Centers for Disease Control. The CDC issued guidelines that said that an early statewide school closure doesn't necessarily stop the spread of coronavirus. And it creates other problems too. It creates more of a pressure on the social network that is part and parcel to a public school system. So the governor attached a lot of his thinking to the CDC guidelines. And what he said was, this is a local decision at this point. Districts can do what they want to do. But he also made it pretty clear that he was encouraging schools to stay open, at least for the time being. This is 10 days ago. I mean, the story has moved so quickly in just the span of a few days. On March 15th, a week ago Sunday, the governor did a conference call with administrators, school administrators, said his preference would be for them to stay open based on the CDC guidelines. Almost immediately, school districts across the state said they were going to close their doors immediately. They were going to roll out a closure, maybe extend spring break or start spring break early, waive absentee rules, and basically give students leeway if their parents decided to keep them home. the state's largest school district, which I think was really interesting, it kind of gives you a sense of the mindset. On March 15th, the day of the governor's conference call, the West Ada School District, 40,000 kids, suburban Boise, by far the largest district in the state, came out and said, we're going to keep our doors open. That was about 3 o'clock on that Sunday afternoon. It was a long Sunday for us because we were tracking what was going on all over the state. By 9 o'clock, West Ada went on its website and said, based on what we've heard from staff and from parents, we're closing our doors immediately. So a very quick pivot by the largest district in the state. I think that that cumulative effect, districts across the state, large and small, urban, suburban, and rural, all saying, we're going to close. We're going to, at least extend spring break or go into an immediate closure. I think that had a cumulative effect on the governor's thinking, on the State Board of Education's thinking. I think it all sort of added up along the way.
Kevin, we've heard some of these stories so far from states that have gone to much work from home orders. Washington State has talked about this. I've seen this in Whitman County, Washington, basically them saying, hey, the IT system in this county is being taxed by so many people now working from home, whether that be for actual work or they're just staying at home. They actually sent out a press release recently to say, stop maybe watching so much Netflix during the day because our county services need it to function. I'm curious how maybe you feel the infrastructure of Idaho is set up to have that happen. Many students, if the school districts have to go to this online education model, if many work employees are staying at home, to work from home and then taking up bandwidth, is that going to tax the critical infrastructure of Idaho, particularly in some of these rural districts or rural areas, and heck, whether they even have a lot of broadband access in some of these more rural areas?
That is going to create a lot of challenges for communities, and it's going to create a lot of challenges for schools. I'll just use West Ada as an example again, because they're concerned about it. And again, this is a suburban school district, fairly low poverty rates relative to the state average. They already know that 9% of the households in that district do not have internet. So they're going to have a challenge of trying to figure out, well, how to get students logged on and doing work and doing meaningful work. How do you continue the educational process in that kind of a situation? And that's West Ada. And like I say, that's a more middle class to upper middle class school district by Idaho standards. You get out into rural Idaho, remote areas where it's kind of hard sometimes just to get the internet access, period. Just hard to get that, that fiber out to some of these rural communities. It's going to be a really big challenge, and it underscores issues that education leaders have been talking about for a long time, issues of access, the potential for widening gaps in access, achievement gaps, even in this short-term emergency pivot to online learning. It's going to be a real challenge. And again, we're only 48 hours as we speak right now. We're only a couple days in, and districts are now just trying to figure out, well, how are we going to do this? We're going to educate kids in this digital setting. We're going to make this dramatic transformation in learning that we could not have imagined having to do just a few weeks ago. How do we do it? And how do we get the devices in the hands of the kids? How do we get them logged onto the internet? Do they have to work in the parking lot of the school and tap into the Wi-Fi from the school? How is this all going to work? It's a big transformation, and it's happening in stunning real time.
It is. It seems we've had decades to maybe prepare, and now we're all certainly figuring it out within the span of a few weeks or even days. I'm curious, though, Kevin, what sort of, I know let's think back to way like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Let's say this didn't happen. I know a counterfactual is always hard to talk about, but there were other things that happened in the state legislature this session, and the legislature dismissed right before this all really kind of hit. So what sort of things came up in the legislature, and would it have been any different had the coronavirus really hit in February rather than mid to late March?
Well, that's a really interesting question. When I look back at the legislative session in terms of education issues, Governor Little had a very successful session. He got funding for everything he wanted. And the biggest item of the bunch is he got the legislature to agree to the first installment of a 5-year plan to increase teacher pay. This is the second time the state has done this, that we just came out of a 5-year plan to increase teacher pay, mostly for beginning teachers, younger teachers. This is more targeted to keeping veteran teachers in classrooms in Idaho. That's a big issue, especially in border communities. I mean, Moscow, Idaho, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, even along the east border of the state bordering against Wyoming. A lot of districts are really struggling to keep their veteran teachers when those teachers can just hop across the state line and get a pretty sizable pay raise. The legislature went along with this, committing to, yes, we would like to spend $223 million over the next 5 years. Passed easily with bipartisan support. And now where is the economy? Where is the economy headed? What is the cash flow situation going to be like for the state? What's the budget situation going to look like in January when legislators have to come back together to convene and decide, is the money available for the second installment of that pay plan? So a month ago we were talking about fairly, fairly routine legislative session in terms of education. Like I say, most of what Governor Little asked for sailed through easily with bipartisan support and not a lot of debate, not a lot of pushback. Everything's changed in terms of that budget, in terms of the economic picture, and we don't know what that's going to look like when the legislature gets back in session in 10 months.
Speaking of back in session in 10 months, wondering if there might be a special session called. Oregon is very likely going to do that. We're not sure in Washington if that might be the need. What about in Idaho? Is there any talk about a special session of the legislature being called to address anything coronavirus related or not?
It's hard to say. I think the legislature tried to leave town last week with sort of a fail-safe in place. What the legislature did in the final hours of the session was that they gave the state's board of examiners, which is pretty wonky, but it's the governor and several other state officials who kind of have authority over balancing the books. They gave that board wide-ranging authority to go into budget reserves to balance the budget on June 30th. The state's budget year ends on June 30th. Legislators were hoping to leave town with about $50-some million worth of cushion. Who knows if that cushion is going to last these final couple of months, or if the state is going to have to go into its budget reserves. The whole idea of doing that, Scott, was that legislators were worried, what if A, the economy tanks, and B, the scope of the coronavirus and the spread of the coronavirus is so widespread that it's unsafe to reconvene a legislative session, and that it's unsafe to bring 105 legislators under the same roof at the same time. How do we make sure that the state balances its books and meets its constitutional obligations for a balanced budget? So I think that was kind of the dead man's switch, if you will, to make sure that the bills will be paid on June 30th. What things look like July 1st, who knows? And whether the legislature may need to reconvene after July and make some decisions before the January start of a routine legislative session, who knows?
Things very much in the air. And one thing that is in the air is whether Governor Brad Little will veto or not veto several bills that were somewhat controversial, you might say, as the legislature came to an end, and those bills specifically relating to issues of transgender issues, both in schools and generally with birth certificates. Tell us a little bit about those issues real quickly. And as we tape this, we should say that Governor Little has said he hasn't said whether he would veto those, but he has until March 31st. So we're not sure yet.
Right. So I think before the coronavirus struck, this legislative session probably would have been best known for some legislation addressing transgender rights. And you alluded to both of them. One is a bill that would ban transgender girls and women from participating in girls and women's sports. This has been heavily lobbied. Critics of the bill have rallied on the State House steps. 5 former attorneys general have urged Little to veto this bill, saying it's unconstitutional in several different ways. The current Attorney General has raised similar constitutional concerns. You have this bill that's still outstanding. You have a second bill that would address changing the gender marker on birth certificates. And this is in direct contradiction to a federal court ruling on the matter. It would ban individuals from changing the gender marker on their birth certificates. This bill sits on the governor's desk. You're right. At this point, the governor has until the evening of March 31st to decide whether to sign these bills, to veto them, or to let them go into law without his signature. We'll wait and see. He's got about 70 bills at this point that are still waiting for his final disposition. He did veto his first bill of the session earlier this week. There was a funding bill regarding transportation funding. His concern then was the budget and the implications for the budget. It'll be interesting to see if the budget becomes a concern with these transgender bills, because if these bills become law, it's certain that the state will be taken to court and will have to defend these bills, and that's going to be expensive, win or lose.
Well, no matter what happens, win or lose, veto or no veto, we know that you'll be there to cover it all. Thanks for joining us today, Kevin Richert. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you. Anytime.
You can see more of Kevin's reporting on these and other topics at idahoednews.org. And for more Northwest news on coronavirus and all other topics, come to our website, nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the Unique Northwest.